Recruit? That tattoo is not fake. That woman was declared dead 9 years ago. Colonel Jonathan Mercer's voice cut across the training yard so sharply that even the horses went still. A moment earlier, Mason Reed had been laughing. He stood beside 3 other recruits near the mounting rail, one hand resting on his helmet, the other pointing toward the black mark exposed beneath Avery Caldwell's rolled sleeve. "Nice fake tattoo," he had said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did it come with the costume?" The laughter had traveled easily across the cold Wyoming morning. Avery had not answered. She had only tightened the leather strap beneath the gray Mustang saddle, her movements slow and exact, as though mockery were no more important than dust on a boot. The horse beside her was different. Cinder lifted her head, ears turning toward Mason, muscles tightening beneath a coat the color of storm clouds. Avery placed 2 fingers against the mare's neck. One quiet breath, one softer breath. Cinder settled. Then Colonel Mercer stepped from the command vehicle. His attention moved first to the woman, then to the tattoo on her forearm. A black viper coiled around a narrow arrow, with 7 small marks beneath its body. The colonel stopped walking. Color faded from his face. For several seconds, he seemed to forget the cold, the recruits, and every regulation that had brought him to Fort Hawthorne that morning. Then his boots came together, his shoulders straightened, and a decorated officer with 31 years of service stood at attention before a woman everyone else had mistaken for a civilian horse trainer. No one laughed now. Mason lowered his hand. Sergeant Daniel Brooks, who had been preparing to end the exchange, stared at Mercer in disbelief. Avery slowly pulled her sleeve down, covering the mark. "That designation was retired, sir," she said. Her voice was calm, but Cinder turned toward her as if she had heard something beneath the words. Mercer's eyes shifted to the Mustang. A thin scar crossed the mare's left shoulder, nearly hidden beneath her winter coat. Recognition struck him a second time. "No one touches her," he ordered. His gaze remained fixed on Avery. "And no one touches that horse." 36 hours earlier, Avery Caldwell had arrived at Fort Hawthorne with 1 canvas bag, a civilian identification card, and a transfer order containing fewer than 6 lines. The paperwork described her as an equine rehabilitation specialist assigned to evaluate a difficult Mustang. It did not mention Black Viper, it did not mention Hollow Ridge, and it did not explain why Cinder, a horse who had rejected every handler at the base, walked to the fence the moment Avery stepped out of her truck. The mare had stood alone in the far corner of the enclosure, 20 yards from the gate, watching the newcomer with dark, guarded eyes. Avery had not called her name. She had simply placed her bag on the ground and waited. For almost an hour, neither woman nor horse moved. Then Avery released 3 low notes through her teeth. Cinder's head rose. The old Mustang crossed the enclosure without hesitation and pressed her forehead against Avery's shoulder. Sergeant Brooks had witnessed the entire thing. "You know this horse?" he asked. Avery closed her eyes for one brief second. Her hand rested against the scar beneath Cinder's coat. "Not in this life," she whispered. From the observation tower above them, Colonel Mercer heard those words through an open radio channel, and for the first time in 9 years, he remembered the sound of a call sign the Army had ordered everyone to forget. Fort Hawthorne had rejected Cinder long before Avery Caldwell arrived. The Mustang had been brought in from federal rangeland 3 years earlier, selected for a mountain mobility program because of her balance, endurance, and instinct for unstable ground. On paper, she was exactly what the base needed. In practice, she refused every rider, ignored standard commands, and became rigid whenever anyone approached with a heavy military saddle. 2 experienced trainers had requested reassignment after failing to earn her trust. A third had written a final recommendation in thick black ink, unsuitable for service. By the time Avery drove through the eastern gate, a red warning sign had already been fastened to Cinder's enclosure. Mason Reed was leaning against the fence with several recruits when Avery walked past carrying her canvas bag. He looked at her plain brown jacket, worn boots, and slender frame, then glanced toward the restless horse in the far corner. "They sent you for that?" he asked. Avery stopped beside the gate. "They sent me to evaluate her." Mason smiled at the others. "You might want to evaluate her from outside the fence." A few recruits laughed, but Avery did not look at them. Her attention remained on Cinder. The Mustang's weight rested too heavily on her right side. Her ears moved toward every metallic sound. Her breathing changed whenever a buckle struck the rail. Avery noticed each detail without taking a single note. Sergeant Daniel Brooks approached from the stable office with a clipboard under one arm. "Miss Caldwell, I assume?" "Avery is fine." Brooks studied her transfer order again, as though hoping the short document would reveal qualifications it had somehow hidden the first time. "You should know that horse does not respond to pressure. She will not accept a bit. She will not load into a trailer, and she has never completed a mounted course." Avery placed her bag beside the fence. "Who decided she was difficult?" Brooks frowned. "Everyone who worked with her." "That was not my question." The sergeant looked toward Cinder. For the first time that morning, his expression softened. "The program did." Avery nodded once. She entered the enclosure without a lead rope, saddle, or training stick. Mason straightened. "That is a bad idea." Avery closed the gate behind her and stopped 20 yards from the Mustang. She did not reach out. She did not call. She simply turned slightly sideways and lowered her gaze, making herself smaller without appearing afraid. Minutes passed. Wind moved through the dry grass beyond the stable. A flag snapped above the administration building. Cinder watched her, tense but curious. Avery adjusted her breathing until it matched the mare's rhythm. Slow in, slower out. The recruits became impatient. Mason checked his watch. "Is standing still part of the evaluation?" Avery gave no answer. After nearly an hour, Cinder took one step forward, then another. The red warning sign trembled against the fence in the wind. Brooks stopped riding. The Mustang crossed the enclosure and halted within arm's reach of Avery. "Ev." Inside the stable, Cinder ignored the open stall prepared for her and stayed close to Avery's left shoulder. The behavior unsettled Sergeant Brooks more than resistance would have. For 3 years, the Mustang had treated every person as a problem to solve or a boundary to defend. Now she followed a stranger through the aisle as quietly as a shadow. Avery stopped beside a rack of standard military tack and examined the equipment without touching it. Heavy saddle, double straps, bright steel buckles. Too much weight, too much noise. She looked at the shallow marks along Cinder's back and then at the polished saddle assigned to her. "This was never made for the way she moves," Avery said. Brooks folded his arms. "It is the same equipment used across the program." "That does not make it right for every horse." Mason and the other recruits gathered near the stable entrance, pretending to check their gear while listening. Avery selected a simple wool pad and a narrow leather line from an older storage hook. Brooks glanced at the faded label. "That equipment has not been issued in years." Avery ran her thumb along the stitching. "It was built for distance, not appearance." She placed the pad where Cinder could see it, allowing the mare to inspect the material before lifting it toward her back. Cinder did not move away. Instead, she lowered her head and released a slow breath. Mason shook his head. "Maybe the horse is just tired." Avery heard him, but her attention shifted to a faint symbol pressed into the leather near the buckle. It was almost invisible beneath years of dust, a narrow arrow crossed by 3 lines. Her hand stopped. Brooks noticed. "You recognize that mark?" Avery wiped the leather clean with her sleeve. "Old inventory code." Her answer came too quickly. Brooks stepped closer, but Cinder moved between them without aggression, placing her body at an angle that blocked his path. Avery touched the mare's neck. 3 light taps. Cinder immediately stepped aside. The movement was exact, practiced, and far too specific to be accidental. Mason's smile faded. "How did you do that?" "I asked her." "You did not say anything." Avery looked at him for the first time. "Not every command needs a voice." A burst of radio static sounded from Brooks's shoulder. The sudden metallic noise made 2 horses farther down the aisle pull against their ties. Cinder remained still, but her ears turned sharply toward the speaker. Avery's posture changed with them. Her shoulders lowered. Her weight shifted. Her eyes moved once toward the rear exit, once toward the windows, and once toward the loft above. It lasted less than a second, but Brooks saw it. That was not the reaction of a civilian surprised by a radio. It was the response of someone who had already counted every route out of the building. "Where did you learn to handle horses this way?" he asked. Avery removed the radio from the edge of the stall before its vibration could trouble Cinder. "In places where noise carried farther than people expected." "What places?" She looked through the stable doors toward the mountains. Clouds were collecting over the western ridge, dark and tightly layered. "Places that are not on your training maps." Brooks studied her face, searching for pride or challenge, but found neither. only weariness, carefully controlled. From the observation office above the yard, Colonel Mercer replayed the open radio transmission. He listened again to Avery's 3 taps, the pause that followed, and the way the Mustang obeyed. Then he opened a secure terminal and entered a code he had not used in 9 years. The system rejected his first request. It denied the second. On the third attempt, a single line appeared on the screen. Mountain reconnaissance records restricted by command authority. Mercer stared at the message while an old memory returned with impossible clarity. A gray Mustang, moving through smoke-colored fog, 3 taps against leather, and a woman's voice whispering that silence was the only safe road home. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped nearly 12 degrees, though the official forecast still promised clear skies until evening. Avery noticed before anyone else. Cinder had stopped facing the stable doors and turned her body toward the west wall, where the wind pressed faintly against the wooden boards. The mare's ears moved toward a sound too distant for the recruits to hear. Avery stepped outside and studied the ridgeline. The clouds were no longer scattered. They had formed a dark shelf above the mountains, flat underneath, and rising sharply at the rear. Sergeant Brooks followed her into the yard. "Weather station says the storm will pass north of us." Avery watched a loose strand of hay lift from the ground and move east. "The station is 6 miles downhill." "You think it is wrong?" "I think the mountain has not read the report." Brooks looked toward the flags above the administration building. They still hung almost motionless. Before he could respond, a metallic snap sounded near the mounting rail. One of the recruits had begun preparing a chestnut gelding for the afternoon navigation exercise. Avery turned immediately. The rider, Ethan Cole, had placed one boot in the stirrup when she crossed the yard and caught the saddle horn. "Step down," she said. Ethan stared at her. "I checked the tack." "Step down." Her voice did not rise, but something in it ended the argument. Ethan returned both feet to the ground. Avery lifted the saddle flap and ran 2 fingers along the girth strap. The leather looked solid from the outside. Underneath, a narrow split had formed around the stitching. Brooks bent closer. "That passed inspection this morning." "It was checked while the horse was standing still," Avery said. "The brake would have opened under weight." Ethan's face changed as he imagined the steep practice trail beyond the eastern fence. Mason Reed walked over with his helmet tucked beneath one arm. "Lucky guess." Avery did not look at him. She removed the damaged strap and placed it on the rail. "Leather dries from the inside first. You listen when it bends." Mason gave a quiet laugh. "Leather does not talk." Avery pressed the strap between her hands. A faint crackle came from the weakened fibers. "Everything talks. Most people only wait for shouting." Brooks said nothing. He had spent 17 years around military horses, yet he had missed the damage. Avery had seen it from 20 feet away. A low rumble moved across the mountains. The horses lifted their heads together. 5 seconds later, the flags above the administration building snapped hard toward the east. Avery was already walking down the line of stalls, checking latches and moving loose equipment away from the aisle. She directed Ethan to close the upper windows and told another recruit to secure the feed-room door. No one had assigned her authority, but everyone followed. Even Mason stopped smiling when the first gust struck the stable and sent dust rolling across the yard. Cinder remained beside Avery without a lead rope, matching every change in her pace. 3 helicopters returning from a training flight appeared above the southern ridge. Their rotors beat against the heavy air. At the sound, Avery's hand moved beneath her jacket and closed around something hanging from her neck. Her face stayed calm, but her eyes fixed on the aircraft until they passed overhead. Cinder pressed closer. Avery released the object and rested her palm against the mare's shoulder. From the observation office, Colonel Mercer watched the gesture through binoculars. For an instant, sunlight caught the edge of a worn metal tag beneath Avery's collar. Mercer lowered the binoculars and turned back to the secure terminal. The restricted screen had changed. Beneath the denial message, a second line had appeared. Biometric archive available through visual confirmation. Mercer looked through the window at Avery, then at the gray Mustang standing beside her. He no longer wondered whether the past had returned to Fort Hawthorne. He wondered why it had chosen this moment. The storm passed along the northern edge of Fort Hawthorne without releasing more than a few cold drops, but it left the training yard restless. Dust clung to the rails. Horses shifted inside their stalls. The recruits spoke more quietly than before, still unsettled by how Avery had predicted the change in weather and found the damaged strap before anyone else. Mason Reed disliked the silence most of all. Until that afternoon, he had been one of the strongest riders in the class. The recruit others watched when an instructor demonstrated a difficult maneuver. Now every conversation seemed to return to Avery and the gray Mustang that followed her without a rope. Mason stood near the course board, while Sergeant Brooks reviewed the next morning's mountain navigation exercise. The route climbed nearly 4 miles through narrow timber, crossed a shallow creek, and ended at an observation marker 800 feet above the stable grounds. Each rider would be graded on control, route selection, and awareness of changing conditions. Cinder's name was not on the roster. A red line had been drawn through her identification number. Mason noticed Avery studying it. The program already made its decision, he said. Avery kept her eyes on the board. Programs do that when people stop asking questions. She has failed every mounted evaluation. She has refused every rider. Mason stepped closer. That sounds like failure to me. Avery turned toward Cinder, who stood at the far end of the paddock watching the mountains. Trust and obedience are not the same thing. Several recruits had gathered behind them. Mason could feel their attention, and his pride hardened beneath it. Then prove it. Take her through the course. Sergeant Brooks lowered his clipboard. That is enough, Reed, Mason continued before the sergeant could dismiss him. If she completes the route, I will admit the horse belongs in the program. If she does not, we stop pretending she is something special. Avery looked at him without anger. That calm expression troubled him more than an argument would have. This is not about what you admit, she said. Then why are you here? Before Avery could answer, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell approached from the administration building with a folder in her hand. The review board meets at 1400 hours tomorrow, she told Brooks. If Cinder does not show measurable progress before then, she will be removed from the mountain unit. Brooks glanced toward the Mustang. Removed where? Mitchell hesitated. Transferred out of military training. The final placement has not been determined. Avery's face did not change, but her fingers closed around the old leather line at her side. Cinder lifted her head at the same moment, as though distance had not prevented her from feeling the movement. Brooks studied Avery carefully. You do not owe anyone a demonstration. No, Avery said, but she deserves an honest evaluation. Mason folded his arms. So you accept? Avery walked to the course board and traced the marked trail with one finger. Her hand paused at the creek crossing, then moved away from the approved route toward an older service path barely visible beneath faded ink. This section will be unstable after the wind, she said. The eastern approach is safer. Brooks leaned closer. That path was closed years ago. Then someone should find out why. She turned toward the paddock. Cinder was already walking to the gate. Avery opened it and the Mustang stopped beside her as if answering a call no one else had heard. We leave at first light, Avery said. Mason smiled, believing he had finally forced her into a mistake. Colonel Mercer, watching from the office above, knew better. On the secure terminal behind him, the visual confirmation request waited for a clear image of Avery's forearm. He looked down at the old trail she had chosen and remembered a classified map bearing the same narrow line. Black Viper had once called it the Silent Road. First light reached Fort Hawthorne as a pale silver line above the eastern ridge. Frost covered the rails, and every breath drifted white in the cold air. The recruits gathered beside the mounting yard, while Sergeant Brooks inspected equipment for the navigation exercise. Mason Reed arrived early, already dressed for the trail, his confidence restored by the presence of an audience. Avery Caldwell stood apart from the group beside Cinder, using only the old wool pad and narrow leather line she had selected from storage. There was no heavy saddle, no polished bit, and no equipment designed to force obedience. Brooks examined the simple arrangement. That does not meet standard course configuration. Avery checked the leather once more. Standard equipment is why she stopped trusting riders. Mason gave a quiet laugh. Or maybe she knows this is all a performance. Cinder turned one ear toward him but remained still. Avery placed her left foot lightly against the mare's side and mounted in one smooth movement. The Mustang did not shift beneath her. Several recruits exchanged surprised looks. For 3 years, Cinder had refused to carry anyone beyond the paddock gate. Now she stood beneath Avery as calmly as if the two had traveled together every morning of their lives. Brooks raised one hand. The route begins at the north marker. You will follow the approved trail, cross the creek, reach the upper observation post, and return before 1000 hours. Avery looked toward the mountains. Thin clouds moved rapidly above the trees. The eastern section is still the safer approach. The official route remains open, Brooks said. Then I will inspect it before trusting it. Mason shook his head. You cannot rewrite the course because you are nervous. Avery looked down at him. Caution and fear are not the same thing. Before Brooks could respond, Cinder moved toward the starting line without a spoken command. Mason stepped in front of the gate, smiling as though he had finally found the right moment to embarrass her. Wait, if you are going to act like some forgotten cavalry legend, at least explain the artwork. He reached toward Avery's sleeve, but she moved her arm away before he could touch it. The motion pulled the fabric above her wrist. Black ink appeared against her fair skin. A viper coiled around a narrow arrow with 7 small marks beneath its body. Mason stared for 1 second, then laughed. That looks fresh. Did you put it on last night for the big ride? The other recruits did not join him immediately. Something about the mark felt too precise, too deliberate. Avery lowered her arm and began pulling the sleeve back into place. At that moment, a command vehicle stopped beside the yard. Colonel Jonathan Mercer stepped out with Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell behind him. He had come to observe the course, but his attention locked onto Avery's exposed forearm. He stopped so suddenly that Mitchell nearly walked into him. The yard became quiet. Mercer crossed the distance slowly, his face drained of every expression except recognition. His eyes followed the black viper, the arrow, and the 7 marks beneath it. Then he brought his heels together and stood at attention. Brooks lowered his clipboard. Mason's laughter disappeared. Avery remained mounted, her hand resting gently against Cinder's neck. Mercer looked up at her as though he were seeing someone return from a place no one was supposed to survive. Viper 2-1, he said. Cinder lifted her head at the call sign. Avery's eyes hardened for the briefest moment. That name was retired, sir. Mercer did not move. The Army retired the record, he answered quietly. It never retired what you did. No one in the training yard moved. Even the horses seemed to understand that something had changed. Mason Reed stood beside the gate with his mouth slightly open, unable to reconcile the quiet woman on the gray Mustang with the call sign Colonel Mercer had spoken. Sergeant Brooks looked from Avery to the colonel, waiting for an explanation that did not come. Mercer remained at attention for another long second before lowering his hand. Lieutenant Mitchell, he said, open the restricted archive. Mitchell hesitated. Sir, those records require command verification. Mercer kept his eyes on Avery. Use mine. The recruits were ordered into the administration building, where the training room had been converted into a temporary briefing area. Avery dismounted without a word. Cinder followed her inside the covered equipment bay and waited near the open doors, calm beneath the pale morning light. On the wall screen, Mitchell entered Mercer's credentials. The system paused, then displayed a black field with a single white line. Visual confirmation required. Mercer looked at Avery's covered forearm. I will not ask you to uncover it again. Avery studied him. You already know what it is. I know what I remember. The system needs proof. She slowly rolled back her sleeve. Mitchell raised a secure camera, and the mark appeared on the screen. The black viper, the narrow arrow, 7 small lines beneath the coil. The system processed the image for several seconds. Then the room lights dimmed automatically, and a red border formed around the display. A name appeared first, Avery Elise Caldwell. Below it came another line, call sign, Viper 2-1. Status, presumed lost. Final assignment, Black Viper Mountain Reconnaissance. Access level, sealed by command authority. Mason stopped breathing for a moment. Brooks read the words twice. Black Viper was real? He asked. Mercer turned toward him. Real enough to save people who were never told their names. Another file opened. It showed no medals, no public record, and no list of victories. Only a mission map, a row of 12 identification numbers, and one final report marked incomplete. The last known location was Hollow Ridge, less than 40 miles west of Fort Hawthorne. Mitchell moved to close the file, but the system continued on its own. A second identification record appeared. It was not for a soldier. It showed a gray Mustang with a narrow scar on the left shoulder. Designation, Viper Mount 7. Recovery status, unknown. Every face in the room turned toward the open bay doors. Cinder stood there, watching Avery. The mare released one low breath, then touched the floor once with her front hoof. Avery's expression softened, but only for an instant. Mercer looked at the horse as if a memory had stepped out of the past and crossed the room. "She was with you," he said. Avery lowered her sleeve. "She brought me home." Mason finally found his voice. "Then why does the record say you were lost?" Avery looked at the screen, at the 12 identification numbers, and at the empty spaces where names should have been. "Because some missions are easier to bury than explain." Mercer stepped closer, his tone careful now. "How many people knew you survived?" Avery did not answer immediately. Outside, wind moved through the stable roof and carried the sound of a distant flag snapping against its pole. "Not enough to change the report," she said. Mitchell stared at the red screen. "Sir, the archive is requesting reactivation authority." Mercer looked at Avery. "Do you want me to approve it?" Avery turned toward Cinder. The Mustang had already shifted her attention to the western mountains, where the first dark clouds of the day were gathering above the silent road. "No," Avery said quietly. "Some names should remain buried until they are needed." The alarm sounded before anyone could speak again. A sharp tone rolled through the administration building, followed by the voice of the duty officer over the public address system. "Mountain Training Team, report status immediately. Repeat, Mountain Training Team, report status immediately." Sergeant Brooks reached for his radio. Static answered him. Lieutenant Mitchell moved to the operations console and opened the tracking map. 3 blue markers blinked near the eastern approach, almost 5 miles from the stable. One marker belonged to Mason Reed. "He was standing here 2 minutes ago," Brooks said. Another instructor entered the room, breathing hard from the run. Reed and 2 recruits left through the north equipment gate. They said they were going to inspect the first section before the evaluation. Brooks closed his eyes for one controlled second. Mason had not left because he was careless. He had left because shame had become more difficult to bear than the mountain. He wanted to return with proof that Avery had exaggerated the danger and 2 younger recruits had followed him. Outside, the wind changed direction so quickly that the stable doors shook in their frames. Mitchell enlarged the map. "Their location signal has stopped moving near the Old Creek crossing." Mercer stepped closer. "The bridge? It was scheduled for inspection next month." The duty officer called again, this time reporting that the wooden crossing had shifted after the previous day's wind. A weather cell was descending from the western ridge, bringing low clouds and freezing rain. The rescue helicopter crew had started its engines, but visibility above the timber was already falling below safe limits. Brooks transmitted again. "Reed, this is Hawthorne Command. Respond." Only static returned. Avery stood near the open bay doors, watching Cinder. The Mustang had turned completely toward the mountains. Her ears were fixed forward, and one front hoof pressed against the concrete as if she could feel something moving through the ground. "They will stay on the marked route," Brooks said, though his voice no longer carried certainty. Avery shook her head. "Mason wanted to prove the marked route was safe. He will keep moving until the mountain proves otherwise." Mercer looked at her. "Can ground vehicles reach them?" Avery studied the terrain display. "Not from the east. The service road narrows at the creek, and the lower slope will be mud within 30 minutes. Mitchell pointed to the faded line Avery had noticed earlier. "What about this trail?" Brooks leaned toward the screen. "That path was closed before I came to the base. No one maintains it." Mercer said nothing. His eyes moved from the old trail to Cinder, then to Avery. The room seemed to contract around the silence. "Does she still remember the silent road?" he asked. Avery's expression changed, not with surprise, but with recognition. Cinder touched the floor once with her hoof. Avery walked to the equipment table and removed the heavy emergency saddle prepared for rescue teams. She replaced it with the wool pad, the narrow leather line, a compact medical bag, and a weatherproof radio. Brooks stepped into her path. "You are not assigned to field response." "Neither are they anymore," Avery said. "They are 3 people who need a way home." Mercer opened a locked cabinet beneath the operations console. From inside, he removed a small metal whistle, darkened by age. A narrow arrow had been engraved along its side. He held it out to Avery. "I kept this because I thought everyone who knew its signal was gone." Avery accepted it without looking down. Cinder entered the building on her own and stopped beside her. "Not everyone," Avery said. The lights flickered as thunder moved over the western ridge. Then woman and Mustang turned toward the open yard, while behind them the restricted archive changed from sealed to awaiting command. Avery crossed the yard with Cinder beside her while the first drops of freezing rain struck the stable roof. She moved without hurry, but every motion carried purpose. The heavy rescue saddle remained on the equipment table. Instead, she secured the wool pad, attached the compact medical bag behind it, and fastened the weatherproof radio to her jacket. The old metal whistle rested beneath her collar beside the worn identification tag Colonel Mercer had glimpsed the day before. Sergeant Brooks followed her into the mounting yard. "The Western Trail has not been inspected in years," he said. "There could be fallen timber, unstable ground, or sections that no longer exist." Avery checked Cinder's left front hoof, then ran one hand along the mare's leg. "The marked trail has already failed them. An old road is still a road if someone remembers it." Brooks looked toward the mountains. Low clouds had covered the upper ridgeline, reducing the familiar landscape to dark shapes and drifting gray. "You cannot see more than a few hundred yards up there." "Cinder does not need to." Avery mounted with the same smooth movement she had used that morning. Cinder turned toward the north gate before receiving any visible signal. Lieutenant Mitchell ran from the administration building carrying a folded map sealed inside a plastic cover. "The last tracking point was 1 mile east of the creek crossing," she said. "The signal vanished 14 minutes ago." Avery studied the map only long enough to confirm what she already understood. Then she folded it and returned it. "Their transmitter is below the ridge. The rock will block everything from the base." "How can you know that?" Mitchell asked. Avery looked at the mountains. "Because that is where the silence begins." Colonel Mercer approached and stopped beside Cinder. He had removed his dress coat and replaced it with a field jacket, but he carried no equipment. He knew this part of the journey did not belong to him. "Command wants a formal authorization before anyone enters the closed route," he said. Avery met his eyes. "How long will that take?" "Longer than the weather will allow." Mercer removed his radio and switched to the command channel. "Hawthorne Operations, this is Colonel Mercer. Record the following order. Temporary field authority is granted to Avery Caldwell for mountain recovery operations. All ground teams will support her route and remain clear of the western approach unless requested." Static followed, then a cautious acknowledgement. Avery said nothing. Mercer lowered the radio. "I could also reopen your military status." "Do not. The archive is waiting." "Let it wait." Thunder rolled across the valley, softer than before, but closer. Cinder shifted her weight toward the gate. Avery placed 2 fingers against the mare's neck. "People do not need a legend today," she said. "They need someone who knows the way." Mercer stepped back. Brooks opened the north gate, and cold wind rushed into the yard. Cinder walked through it, then broke into a steady mountain pace that wasted no energy. Avery did not pull the leather line. She let the mare choose each step as they crossed the open field and entered the pines. Behind them, the base disappeared beneath rain and mist. The radio produced only fragments of voices. Avery turned it down and listened instead to the ground, the wind, and Cinder's breathing. At the edge of the closed route, a rusted chain blocked the trail. Avery dismounted, lifted it from the post, and found an old symbol cut into the wood beneath it. A narrow arrow crossed by 3 lines. Cinder touched the mark with her nose. Avery rested her hand against the mare's scar. "You remember," she whispered. Cinder stepped onto the forgotten path without hesitation. Far behind them, inside the administration building, the sealed archive changed again. The screen displayed one final message. "Black Viper field signal detected." The silent road climbed beneath a canopy of dark pines, narrowing until the trail became little more than a line of exposed stone above the creek. Freezing rain tapped against Avery's jacket and gathered along Cinder's mane, but the Mustang kept a steady pace. She did not rush. She placed each hoof with the care of an animal that remembered where the mountain could be trusted and where it could not. Avery let the leather line rest loose in her hand. The radio at her shoulder crackled with broken fragments from Fort Hawthorne, then faded beneath the ridge. She turned the volume lower. Out here, machines offered less information than the ground. A fresh scrape marked one tree at shoulder height. 20 yards farther on, mud had been pushed backward by 3 horses moving too quickly uphill. Avery dismounted and touched the edge of one print. Rain had softened it, but not erased it. Mason and the others had passed less than an hour earlier. Cinder lowered her nose toward the trail, then stopped. Her ears moved forward. Avery heard nothing at first. Then came a faint metallic knock from somewhere beyond the trees. 3 uneven sounds. A pause. 2 more. "They are using a stirrup against rock," she said. Cinder stepped off the main trail and entered a narrow opening concealed by wet branches. The path descended toward the creek, where fog gathered between the trees. Avery moved beside her now, one hand resting against the mare's shoulder. The old route curved away from the damaged bridge and followed a natural shelf above the water. It had not appeared on the modern map because Black Viper had never marked it for anyone outside the unit. Cinder slowed near a fallen pine. Instead of forcing her forward, Avery waited. The Mustang looked left, where the ground appeared steeper, but remained firm beneath a layer of needles. Avery followed her choice. Minutes later, the metallic signal sounded again, clearer now. "Mason," Avery called. "Stay where you are." A voice answered from below, strained by cold and embarrassment. "We are here." Avery reached the edge of a shallow ravine and found the 3 recruits gathered on a narrow strip of ground beside their horses. The marked trail had given way near the creek, leaving them unable to return, without crossing unstable soil. No one appeared seriously hurt, but one recruit, Ethan Cole, was shivering hard, and the youngest rider, Noah Grant, had lost one glove. Mason stood closest to the slope, trying to hold the group together while pretending he was not afraid. Relief crossed his face when he saw Avery, then disappeared beneath shame. "The bridge shifted," he said. "We tried to turn back." Avery looked once at the ground, the horses, and the darkening clouds. "You did the right thing by stopping." Mason blinked, clearly expecting judgment. Avery opened the medical bag, handed Noah a dry pair of gloves, and wrapped a warming blanket around Ethan's shoulders. She checked each horse and shortened 2 loose straps. Then she pointed toward Cinder. "She will lead. Keep 12 feet between horses. Do not pull against them if they choose a different step than you would." Mason looked toward the hidden path. "That route is not on the map." The mountain was here before the map. Thunder moved far above them. Avery mounted Cinder and turned toward the narrow shelf. The gray Mustang took the first step without hesitation. One by one, the other horses followed. Halfway across, Mason's horse froze at a section where water moved beneath loose gravel. Avery did not shout. She raised the old metal whistle and released 3 low notes. Cinder stopped and looked back. Mason's horse lifted its head, listened, and stepped forward. When they reached solid ground, Mason rode beside Avery in silence for several minutes. "Why did you come after me?" he finally asked. Avery kept her eyes on the trail. Rain moved across her face, cold and steady. "Because leaving people behind is how Black Viper ended." For the first time, she spoke the name without trying to bury it. Cinder's ears turned toward her voice, and the silent road opened ahead. The return journey demanded more patience than speed. Freezing rain had turned the upper trail slick, and the fog pressed between the trees until every rider could see little more than the horse ahead. Avery kept Cinder at a measured walk. She watched the mare's ears, the angle of her neck, and the way each hoof tested the ground before accepting it. Behind them, Mason repeated Avery's instructions to Ethan and Noah without adding anything of his own. His voice had lost its earlier sharpness. When Noah's horse drifted too close to the edge of the trail, Mason guided him back with a quiet hand signal instead of a command. Avery noticed, but said nothing. The silent road climbed toward an abandoned relay point hidden beneath fallen branches. Cinder stopped at the remains of a wooden post and refused to pass. Avery dismounted. Beneath the wet leaves, she found a small metal plate marked with the same narrow arrow that appeared on Mercer's whistle. 7 shallow lines had been cut below it. Her fingers rested against the plate. For a moment, the mountain around her seemed to change. Rain became distant rotor wash. The scent of wet pine became cold canvas and leather. She heard voices that had not crossed this ridge in 9 years, each one calm because fear had never been useful to them. Cinder touched Avery's shoulder with her nose. The memory released her. Mason had dismounted several feet away. "Were they your people?" he asked. Avery cleared the leaves from the marker. "They still are." "The 7 marks on your arm." She stood slowly. "Names I promised not to forget." Mason looked toward Ethan and Noah, then back at the narrow path behind them. "I thought the mark was about rank." "Rank tells people where you stand in a formation," Avery said. "It does not tell them who you are when the formation is gone." She remounted, and the group continued. Near the lower ridge, the radio at her shoulder returned with a burst of static. Sergeant Brooks's voice broke through. "Recovery team, report." Avery pressed the transmitter. 3 recruits located. All 3 are moving. No serious injuries. 4 horses returning by the western route. The silence on the channel lasted only a second, but relief filled it. "Copy that," Brooks answered. "North Gate is clear. Medical staff standing by." Mason reached for his own radio, then stopped. "Sergeant, this was my decision," he said. "The others followed me. Responsibility is mine." Brooks did not respond immediately. When he did, his tone was firm but controlled. "We will discuss responsibility after everyone is home." Avery glanced back at Mason. He did not look away. The fog began to thin as they descended. Fort Hawthorne appeared below them, its stable lights glowing through the gray afternoon. Riders, instructors, and support staff stood beyond the north gate. No one spoke as Cinder emerged from the trees with Avery seated quietly above her, and the three recruits following in single file. Mercer waited at the center of the yard. Mason dismounted first and helped Noah down before attending to his own horse. Then he walked to Avery and removed his helmet. "I was wrong about her," he said, looking at Cinder. His eyes rose to Avery. "And about you." Avery placed a hand against the Mustang's neck. "Being wrong is not the part that defines you. What you do after learning the truth does." Medical staff led Ethan and Noah toward the warm operations building. Mason remained beside the horses, loosening straps and checking each animal exactly as Avery had taught him. Mercer watched the change in silence. Then he approached Avery and held out the old metal whistle. She had forgotten it was still around her neck. "You used the road," he said. Cinder remembered it. Mercer looked at the mare, then toward the 7 marks hidden beneath Avery's sleeve. His next question came softly, with the weight of 9 unanswered years. "How many of Black Viper came home from Hollow Ridge?" The question settled over the yard more heavily than the rain. Avery remained beside Cinder, one hand resting against the Mustang's neck while water gathered along the mare's gray coat. Around them, the base had gone quiet. Mason stood near the other horses with his helmet held against his chest. Sergeant Brooks and Lieutenant Mitchell waited several feet away, both aware that Mercer had asked for more than a number. Avery looked toward the western ridge, where the silent road disappeared beneath the trees. "One soldier," she said. Her fingers moved slowly through Cinder's wet mane. "One Mustang." Mercer lowered his eyes. He had read the final report 9 years earlier. 12 members assigned. No confirmed return. No bodies recovered. No explanation beyond operational loss. The words had been clean, official, and empty. Standing before Avery now, he understood that someone had been left to carry everything the report had removed. "What happened at Hollow Ridge?" he asked. Avery did not answer immediately. Cinder shifted closer until her shoulder touched Avery's arm. The small movement seemed to steady them both. "The unit was sent to keep a mountain corridor open," Avery said. "A medical convoy needed 3 hours to cross before the weather closed the pass. Black Viper was supposed to guide them through and leave by the southern route." Mercer's face tightened. "The southern route was canceled." After we were already committed, no anger entered her voice. That made the words land harder. "The radio changed. The extraction point changed. Then communication disappeared." Mitchell glanced toward the operations building, where the sealed archive still waited for command authority. "Why was that never included in the report?" Avery looked at her. "Because the convoy reached safety. The mission was recorded as successful." Mason's expression changed. "And your team?" Avery's hand stopped against Cinder's neck. "My team stayed behind so the road would remain open." She did not describe panic or chaos. She spoke only of decisions made quietly. One teammate returned to repair a signal marker. Another remained at a narrow pass to guide the final vehicle through. Their commander gave Avery the old metal whistle and ordered her to take Cinder down the western trail, if the weather turned. "I refused," she said. "He asked whether I trusted him. I said yes. Then he told me trust means following an order even when it breaks your heart." The wind moved across the yard, carrying the soft sound of halter rings touching wood. Mercer looked at the 7 marks hidden beneath Avery's sleeve. "Those are for them?" "Those are so I never allow the record to make them smaller than they were." Avery explained that she had reached the old relay point before the storm erased the trail. Cinder had stopped there and refused to continue without her. For 2 days, the Mustang found water, shelter, and the road back through terrain Avery could no longer recognize. When they finally reached an outpost, Black Viper had already been listed as lost. Avery's condition made her account easy to question, and the mission was sealed before she could change it. "Why did you disappear?" Brooks asked. Avery looked toward Mason, Ethan, and Noah. "Because surviving can make people treat you like evidence instead of a person." Mercer took one step closer. You should have been honored. Avery shook her head. They should have been remembered? Cinder lowered her head, and Avery pressed her forehead lightly against the mare's. Mason stared at the ground. The young man who had once laughed at a mark he did not understand now saw what it carried. Mercer straightened, not as a colonel before a former operative, but as one soldier before the keeper of 7 names. Then we will correct the record, he said. Avery looked at him. Correct their names first. By sunrise, the storm had moved east, leaving Fort Hawthorne beneath a clear sky and a thin layer of silver frost. The stable yard looked different in the morning light. The red warning sign no longer hung on Cinder's enclosure. Mason Reed had removed it before anyone else arrived. He found a piece of sandpaper in the maintenance room, cleaned the rough edges from the wooden rail, and repaired the loose hinge Avery had noticed on her first day. When Sergeant Brooks entered the yard, Mason was carrying fresh water to the Mustang's stall. He did not announce what he had done. He simply finished the work and stepped aside when Cinder approached. The mare watched him carefully, then lowered her head to drink. It was not trust, but it was a beginning. Inside the administration building, Colonel Mercer had spent most of the night with Lieutenant Mitchell reviewing sealed records. The final report from Hollow Ridge had been reopened. The missing names were restored one by one, not as numbers, but as soldiers who had completed their duty. The language declaring the unit lost through operational failure was removed. In its place, the record stated that Black Viper had held the mountain corridor until the final medical vehicle reached safety. Avery's survival status was corrected, but at her request, no public ceremony was scheduled. She did not want cameras, speeches, or a polished version of the past. She wanted 7 names placed where future recruits could read them. Mercer found her near the north gate with Cinder already prepared for the morning. Command approved the correction, he said. Avery looked toward the western ridge. All of it? All 7 names. He held out a folder containing new orders. They also approved the restoration of your rank and offered you command authority over the mountain program. Avery did not take the folder. I am not returning to service. Mercer nodded as if he had expected the answer. Then stay as an instructor. Avery looked at Cinder. The Mustang stood quietly beside her, free of the heavy equipment that had once made her resist every rider. I will teach them how to listen, Avery said, not how to follow legends. Mercer lowered the folder. That may be exactly what they need. At 800 hours, the recruits assembled in the yard. No one had ordered a formation. Brooks had only told them that Avery would lead the first revised mountain navigation lesson. Mason stood at the front, helmet tucked beneath one arm. Ethan and Noah waited beside him. When Avery entered with Cinder, conversation faded on its own. She wore the same plain brown jacket she had arrived in, and the Black Viper mark remained covered beneath her sleeve. She carried no visible rank. She did not need one. Mason stepped forward. The horses are checked, the weather report is confirmed, and the western route markers are ready for inspection. Avery studied him for a moment. Did you inspect the straps under load? Yes, ma'am. Did you ask what the horses noticed? Mason glanced toward Cinder. Not yet. Then the inspection is not finished. He nodded and returned to the line without embarrassment. Before Avery mounted, Mercer walked into the yard and came to attention. One by one, Brooks, Mitchell, and the recruits followed. No command passed between them. The gesture moved through the formation because each person understood it. Avery looked across their faces, then at the open gate beyond them. She did not return the salute. Instead, she placed one hand on Cinder's neck and said, respect the road, respect the animal beneath you, and never confuse silence with weakness. Cinder carried her through the gate. The recruits followed at a measured distance, quieter than they had ever been. Above the stable entrance, a new wooden plaque caught the morning sun. It carried 7 names and one simple line. They kept the road open. Avery never asked anyone to honor her past. She only taught them to become worthy of the people who had trusted them with the future.